This panel is going to be on bridging the divide, opportunities for bipartisan cooperation. One of the stories that doesn't get reported so often because it's not red meat is that every day there are people working across party lines to make elections better in the states on issues that aren't really all that divisive across party lines. And hopefully today, this morning, we're going to hear about some of those examples. We're going to be moderated by Carrie Levine, right? Not Levine? Okay, Levine, thank you, from Votebeat, who's a wonderful reporter in this area. To Carrie's left is Rey Valenzuela, who's the Director of Elections of Maricopa County, Arizona, in the Recorder's Office. And to Rey's left is Secretary of State Adrian Fontes from the state of Arizona, who used to hold the office of Recorder of Maricopa County, Arizona. You were Rey's boss, right, then? Yeah.
Yes, I hired Rey.
Yeah.
I did.
To Secretary Fontes' left is Professor Rebecca Green from William & Mary Law School. To Rebecca's left is Tiffany Lee, Clerk of Plata County, Colorado. And last but definitely not least, on the far left is, and that's no political consideration whatsoever.
It might be.
Is Secretary of State Jena Griswold from the state of Colorado. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Carrie.
Thanks so much, David, and thanks everyone for coming out this morning for this. I've been looking forward to it. Thanks everyone for being here. I wanted to kick it off. We're here to talk about bridging the partisan divide. And so I wanted to kick it off with Tiffany, with Secretary Griswold, talking a little bit about how they've worked together with clerks across Colorado to address the misinformation and disinformation that's been circulating about elections. I think the clerks in Colorado have really come together on this. And so I was hoping that Tiffany could kick us off by talking a little bit about that, and Secretary Griswold can maybe talk a little bit about how she works with local officials.
Sure, thank you. And it is so important to have the relationship with your Secretary of State and the County Clerks Association. We do have a very strong County Clerks Association, and it's never been more important than it is right now. I've done this a very long time, so 27 years, worked in 2 different states under now 5 different secretaries, and the relationship is imperative. The communication, especially with all the misinformation that we have, if we don't work together, it can be disastrous. So as a county clerk, we also need to be able to work very closely with our legislators during times like this. And with the guidance of the secretary and her staff, and then our executive director and our executive board, I think we've been very successful. Yes, it has its challenges. We don't always agree, absolutely, every time. But overall, just to get the correct information, the secretary's done a really good job, and let her talk to you about that, about what she's done from the state level and being able to give that information down to the county level. I'm what's considered a medium-sized county, so I have approximately 42,000 voters. So I don't necessarily have all the resources that maybe a larger county like Denver might have. So being able to work with our secretary and get that information out, get those great press releases and social media, and being able to just mirror that and copy that and push it down to counties like mine. If you think about in Colorado, we have 64 different counties, and I'm about number 11 as far as the size. So there's a lot of counties that are much smaller than me. So having the relationship is really important.
I think that's right. So when I became Secretary of State, I won the seat in 2018, was sworn in 2019. So right on the heels of Russia trying to meddle in American elections, followed by the pandemic and now the attack on voting rights we're living in. And so I launched, as Secretary of State, the first state office to counter disinformation. So we would take a proactive approach, not wait for the lies to permeate Colorado's sense of what was happening, but we got out there really quickly. And we do partner with the counties, understanding that, number one, the resources we're using, federal HAVA grants, it's really easy to get out of compliance, so we run a lot of the proactive communications through the office and then actually package in coordination with the clerks communication plans for the counties. But I think our efforts have been very successful. And in the 2022 general election, we do paid initiatives to reach Coloradans to alert them that they are subject to disinformation campaigns from our foreign adversaries, and to direct them to a trusted source, whether that's the county clerk's office, my office, DHS, FBI. And we did a couple things last election. First, we featured a clerk employee from a Republican county with a clerk employee from a Democratic county, so that we're getting this bipartisan message. And they're actually talking in that spot about the conspiracies and why the conspiracies are not true. And then I also did a proactive PSA with Wayne Williams, who was my 2018 Republican opponent, former Republican Secretary of State, alerting Coloradans about the prevalence of disinformation. And we haven't, even though I think sometimes people are puzzled by how much disinformation and attacks on voting infrastructure we have had. I was so grateful that we did that initiative with former Republican Secretary of State Wayne Williams, because it was filmed right before two statewide candidates said their elections were stolen. So both a Secretary of State candidate and a US Senate candidate during our primary, after they lost, said, "Oh, there's no way I could have lost." You guys know the story. Something must be wrong if I lost. It was only okay if I won. Well, you all know that's not how elections work, but we were ready with the counter to alert folks, no, actually that's not true. Colorado's elections are safe and secure. Go to a trusted source.
So I wanted to follow up on that by going to Rebecca, who has studied, I think, partisan actors in US elections and who is part of a national task force on election crises and has been since 2018. So I think has been watching this change over the last few years. And I wanted to follow up on what Secretary Griswold said, what Tiffany Lee said, and ask you how you've seen it change. As someone who's been watching this as an expert, as an election law expert, how have you seen things change since 2018? And how does it speak to the efforts that they've just talked about?
I've been thinking a lot about the role of partisan actors in the administration of our elections. And can't hear very well. Oh, maybe it's my hair.
There you go.
Is that better? Can you hear me? Oh, that's so funny. Okay, sorry about that. So I've been thinking a lot about the role of partisan actors within election administration, and particularly sort of the public perception of partisanship in election administration. And I don't think it's since 2018 that it's necessarily been a problem. We obviously in 2000 with Katherine Harris, we saw lots of concerns about partisan election administration and the effects on public confidence in our election system. But I think that the narrative has been exacerbated in the last several years, this feeling that if people from my party aren't running the election, then I can't trust the outcome. And last summer particularly, I was really worried about the narrative that we were seeing in the headlines about people running for office who doubted the 2020 election, and what would happen if they gained office, and then nobody would trust elections, right? We would have 70% of Republicans already not trusting elections, and then potentially a huge hit to Democratic voters' confidence in election outcomes. And so I worried about what that would what would happen in a world where people were really worried about partisan involvement in the administration of our elections. And so I started to think about and research and sort of dig into the history of partisanship in election administration in this country. And I've tried to argue in a paper that is coming out that partisanship in election administration in the United States is deeply American, and particularly the idea of adversarial partisan administration. And I think we heard some of this yesterday as people were talking about the power that election administrators have in working across the aisle. And I love the example that Secretary Griswold just provided of harnessing adversarial partisanship to help people understand that elections are run in a way that has partisan checks from top to bottom and can be trusted for that reason. So that's a narrative that I've really been trying to propagate and get out there more.
So to follow up on that, how do we use the involvement of partisan actors in U.S. elections, which isn't going away? As you point out, it's deeply embedded. How do we use that to build trust instead of to break it down?
Yeah, I think I think we change the narrative that partisan involvement in elections is a problem. I mean, there's all kinds of criticism of election administration in the United States as an outlier, as that we are the only country, the only advanced democracy that has partisan involvement in election administration. And I think changing that narrative to suggest that the fact that we have partisans from opposing party poll watchers to 48 states have requirements that poll workers be from opposing parties, to partisan involvement at boards at various levels. We have a system of checks and balances that make our elections more accountable and more transparent because of partisan involvement.
That's really interesting. I want to follow up and keep this going with Secretary Fontes right now, actually. So Secretary Fontes, you're a Democrat. One of your priorities in taking office, I think, has been to work with counties on their election administration. You've asked for more resources and staff to do that, to support counties in Arizona working on their elections. So how do you approach that when you have a situation like the situation in Cochise County, where they've now hired someone who has spread misinformation about elections to be their new elections director, right? How do you approach that when you have those differences, when you're working with people around the state who not only are not of your party, but who believe things about elections that you think are not true?
Well, I think there's two ways. First, thanks for having us. There's a couple of pieces to the puzzle here, and I have to agree that I think the checks and balances that come along with partisanship involvement in the administration of elections is a positive thing. I think the idea of transparency and that balance really helps, because everything's on the table at that point. But when it comes to dealing with folks, for example, in Cochise County, the election director that they have recently hired actually comes from another county, from La Paz County, Arizona. So it's not like he's new to Arizona election administration. It's not like he's new to the rules. It's not like he's new to the process. It's not like he's new to this secretary or that set of statutes. And so the way that we deal with it is just the way that we deal with anyone. Are you doing your job? Are you doing it well? Are you being diligent and timely in the execution of your duties? Our job really at the Secretary's office, and most states are built just a little differently, is, at the Secretary of State, we're like the commissioner of the NFL. We've got a whole bunch of teams out there.
Is that good? I'm just checking.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's good if you're a sports fan like me, but I've got 15 teams. They wear their own color uniforms. They call their own plays on the field. They do their own stuff, but they have to follow the rules that we set out for them. They have to make sure that the guidelines that we put out there is followed, and our job is to regulate them, to make sure that they're doing that. And as long as you're acting professionally and respectfully, most people, regardless of what their opinion about this or that, are going to do very well within that scope of operation. And occasionally you will get folks who might need a little bit of needling and a little bit of prodding, perhaps a letter reminding them, by the way, this process can be followed and must be followed. This process is illegal, and to suggest it is problematic, right? And if you do those sorts of things with diligence early enough, you can really avoid a lot of problems. I think one of the issues that we've had in the past is as the regulator, the Secretary of State's office, and this goes back several secretaries in a row, really didn't really assert that and say, hey, you got to have an election plan to us, or at least published to your folks by this amount of time. Where's the plan, right? We're a bottom-up state, so we're not in charge of all of the execution of these things, but we certainly are sort of the Jiminy Cricket in the room. We've got to make sure that folks understand that there are expectations, that we want to make sure that they follow the expectations for their voters and for the law, not necessarily for us and our office. But like, I'm not the czar of elections. I'm the chief election officer, which means we're officiating this to make sure it goes well. And so giving folks the space that they need to do what they need in their own counties. Maricopa, for example, is the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States of America. Greenlee County has, 6,000 total voters.
Yeah,
it's very, very small. And so we've got this entire scope of varying diversity of needs and voter populations in Arizona. So we've got to make sure that we present a set of regulations that are going to work for everybody. And they're going to be executable by everybody. And as long as we act professionally and well, and we just sort of do that gentle nudging during our meetings along the way, generally speaking, things work out very well.
So the occasional sternly worded note and, standing on their shoulder.
Well,
Jiminy
and
Cricket
it can come in the form of a variety of different ways. I mean, the Association for Clerks is strong in Colorado. I know the Recorders Association in Arizona meets every other week. The Elections Officers Association, which then pulls in the election directors from each of the counties, is also relatively strong. We are restarting up our communications meetings from the Secretary's office, which is a monthly meeting where we talk about what language we're going to be using, sort of what sets of information we're going to be promoting, whether it's on the internet or broadcast or radio or print, so that folks will know what's going on and they'll be able to reflect back and sort of promote, as was indicated, those sorts of messages. So we do have that same sort of set of communication, but we've got to stay above the partisan fray in the execution of our office. I think we've done pretty well so far, and we've got lots of examples in Arizona of that bipartisanship really making a very positive difference.
And so I wanted to turn to Rey, whose office oversees early voting and voter registration, right? Because in Arizona, the responsibilities are divided up in that way. And as part of that, I think you probably have to work with a lot of local political party officials to do that, to execute that based on how this works in Arizona. In this climate, can you talk about how you approach that and how you make everything work?
Sure. Sticking with the team theme, if this is Geppetto, then we're Team Pinocchio in Maricopa, I guess, where we always have that Geppetto on our shoulder. And I did indeed work for Recorder Pontius. I've worked for 3 recorders in my career. I've been in elections for 30 years, so under, everybody may know Helen Purcell, the history, the Purcell principle established under that. I worked under Recorder Fontes and now Recorder Richard. And one of them was the best recorder I've ever worked with. Now, on to the bipartisan part.
You're going to leave us hanging.
Smooth.
Exactly.
He's so smooth.
But indeed, bipartisanship is a necessary element. Everybody knows, preaching to the choir here, to have fair and impartial. So part of it is driven by statute, and as it should be, this says you must have bipartisan boards, and that has, although sometimes it's not accepted, and it's ironic that everything we do, established in Arizona state statute, and I'm sure all other states have their laws, require every board we have to be partisan, damn and a rep. But it also goes a step further, and why we work with the political parties is it requires most of them, example, our hand count post-election, we facilitate it, we don't conduct it. There's a 2% random sampling that's done after every election. A lot of our voters, even in Arizona, don't realize for 16 years we've been doing hand count. So when they chant, hand count the ballots, we said, we are. And it's actually required, but it also goes that one step further for us to contact the county political party chairs. Dems, Reps, Libertarians, there's 3 recognized, well now 4. No Labels Party that was just certified, but they—
Certified but not endorsed.
Yes, as you're staying unpartisan and Geppetto of you, very Geppetto of you. But the fact is, for the 2020, 2022, the 3 partisan, we are required to reach out to them, facilitate that hand count, and that board is appointed. Every single board member, for the most part, in our process as bipartisan, is appointed by the county chair. So when that Democrat, that Republican, that Libertarian 3-member board are sitting there, we can honestly say, that is not, we can do a hand count to 10 and say it all came out perfect, or we say, you're in charge of it, we facilitate it. They also, the county chairs, randomly select the ballots from polling place, this batch of early ballots. So to some point, there is no way for us to inject anything. They are actually taking raw samplings. So that impartiality, not only, again, it's a necessary element for fair and impartial elections, but that part allowing us to say, and it sounds terrible, but it wasn't us. If anybody's going to complain, and ironically, like I said, people said, well, that hand count was all rigged, and then you had precinct committeemen from those political parties stand up and say, I was sitting on that. I'm the one that did it. That somewhat saved us to the extent of saying, here's the results. There was 0% variance. We looked at 47,000 vote positions, and 0, the machines did not, and these were randomly selected. Now, with that said, you still have people say, terrible, I don't believe it. But it's a necessary element of the process, and working with the parties helps us maintain that integrity.
So an example of what Professor Green was talking about, partisan involvement being used to build trust.
Yes.
So Secretary Griswold, I think back to you on that. In Colorado, since the 2020 election, there's been some new laws passed to address situations that have come up. I think I've heard a lot of election law experts, I don't know if I've heard Professor Green say it, but maybe she would, say that bipartisan election law is better election law. Can you talk a little bit about the process of getting laws passed in Colorado, of getting support for it, and how that worked?
Absolutely. I will say bipartisan election law is the best way to go, but we should not act just because we don't have bipartisan support. When we were in the thick of 2020, there were a lot of people who would say standing up for the right to vote is partisan, right? The last election, coming out and calling people election deniers when they are trying to breach trust of American elections is partisan. And I also think we have to reject that. Mm-hmm. Standing up for a system where every Republican, Democrat, and unaffiliated voter can make their voice heard, and rejecting the folks who would use threats against election workers, lies to try to manipulate the American public, lies to try to steal an election is not partisan, it's American. So number one, we have to reject the label of being partisan, a partisan Democrat for standing up for voting rights. No, that's democratic, small d, that's what every one of us should do. So that's number one. But number two, I think we have had a great deal of success in Colorado in leading the nation in quickly adjusting our laws to the evolving threats. So in, the summer of 2021, I was fortunate or unfortunate to be the first Secretary of State to address an insider threat in the country. And I see that as a real turning point in how Colorado has really addressed the attack on voting rights. Because suddenly all we know is the passwords to a very Republican-leaning county are on the internet, and they were tweeted out by the alleged leader of QAnon. So we know there's a security breach. We don't know exactly what happened. My job as Secretary of State is to make sure that Coloradans are voting in safe and secure elections and that the counties are following our security protocols. So I sent our civil servants over to investigate. It's in Mesa County. As the Republican district attorney executed search warrants. And why I think that was such a turning point is that you could see a path where the Democratic Secretary of State is going to investigate whether there's a security breach in a very conservative county and whether it was going to be a big political fight. But what happened is the Clerks Association, we have 64 counties in Colorado. The vast majority of county clerks are Republican. The Clerks Association is led by a former Republican county clerk. Instead of making it into a political fight before an election year, they actually joined me in supporting the efforts to investigate what was happening in that county and subsequently decommissioning the voting equipment, asking a court to remove that county clerk from oversight of her elections. And then again, I appointed my 2018 Republican opponent, former Republican Secretary of State Wayne Williams, to oversee that county. And I bring that up because there's these moments of time where Republicans and Democrats can choose to fight against each other for elections or can choose to come together for the better good. And I think in Colorado, I've been so impressed by the county clerks, we have 3 of them here, because at every juncture where there is this opportunity to score political points or to just do the right thing, I'm really proud of my office and the county clerks because we all believe in the bigger good, do the right thing. So we got through Mesa County. We subsequently passed a series of laws in 2021. All of them had the Clerks Association support. We made it a crime to dox or retaliate against election workers. We made it, we passed the first law in the nation on insider threats. It's now a felony to compromise voting equipment. It's a felony to push out the passwords to voting equipment. We protected whistleblowers to make sure whistleblowers could come forward. We also, the clerk supported a new law actually for the statewide executive so that I get regular state patrol protection. I think Tiffany said it really well. We don't always agree. We don't, but the vast majority of time we do, or we can get to a compromise. And I think when we don't agree, the association and myself, we respect each other enough to understand there's policy differences. And that's how American politics should work. That is. And taking it a step back from the Secretary of State's office relationship with the county clerks, which I think is one of the strongest relationships in the country that has been built really over decades between various secretaries and the clerks. But taking a step back from that, in American politics, Democrats and Republicans, it's okay for us to disagree. That is how our system is built. What is not okay is to lie about how elections work. What's not okay is to incite violence against your political opponents. What's not okay is if you run in a free and fair election to lie if you lose, right? So I do think every Democrat, unaffiliated, and Republican elected official has the moral obligation to call out the conspiracies and lies because they do incite violence. And we need to reset the country where we have our differences, we decide at the ballot box, but then we unite again as Americans to really serve the American people.
And I want to ask Tiffany to build on some of that. How do the clerks, and you're unaffiliated, we were talking about that before the panel, how do the clerks of, with their different political persuasions come together at times like this and advocate as a group, advocate as a body? It must have been very shocking to have an insider threat like that emerge in one of your counties, and it must have been difficult for the clerks to process that. How did you all come together and find a way forward and a course of action that you could join on? And you yourself have been very outspoken, I think, about saying that people who question elections should present evidence.
Absolutely.
Which as a reporter I appreciate. We love the evidence. Keep doing that. Help us out. But how did you decide that it was time to be very full-throated about that as part of this?
No, it's a great question, Carrie. And it's really hard to explain because being in the position we were in, who would have known somebody could do what they did in that county? And I knew that we needed to come together with the secretary, and we did offer input about what we thought would be the right decision, and taking over the election was absolutely what needed to happen, and to remove that particular county clerk. The secretary did a wonderful job, and her staff, of supporting Mesa County staff that was still left there. Think about that. Your leader committed a crime, right? And now these poor staff are having to figure out what to do next. We all offered support the best that we possibly could, and it was the right decision. I want to back up a little bit to how Colorado has been very successful with working with our secretaries and reforming elections. So in 2013, there was, that's when our big reform happened. So when we went to an all-mail ballot state with voter service and polling centers. We also revamped a lot of different election laws, and there was a group of us, primarily Republicans, at the time I was a Republican, and we really were just listening to our voters. We were listening to the people. What did the people want? We had over a 70% absentee voting rate, and we were hearing so much confusion from voters across the aisle, both sides. One election is all polling places, the next election is mail ballot, depending upon which cycle we were in. Very confusing for people. So again, a group of us, Democrats, Republicans, independents, all worked together, activist groups, our legislators, and we reformed election law. Was it easy? Absolutely not. And the reason I'm talking about this is we thought we were doing a great job, right? All this bipartisan collaboration. We introduced the bill, and we knew there was a window of opportunity. And sometimes you have to look at that as well. We had the House and Senate that were they were the Democrats. And us as Republicans thought, okay, here we are. We've got this small window. And we were able to pass it with zero Republican support. And as a Republican at the time, it was very, very challenging. And we took a lot of backlash. But the beauty of it is our association and the clerk stayed very strong because, again, our whole objective is to the voters, to all voters, all eligible electors. That's our only concern. And I think it was a gentleman yesterday from California said it very well. In our positions as county clerks, we don't think about partisanship. We think about our constituents and what are they asking us to do. Not all the time, at that particular time, it was not under Secretary Griswold, but the secretary disagreed with us. We had no support, actually, from the Secretary of State at that time for our particular change in Colorado law. However, again, we're an extremely strong association, and we were able to make it work. Now, here we are with a lot of clerks, and it's the communication piece between secretary and clerk, like I was talking about before. We are boots on the ground. We're the ones having to implement the laws that are put before us, whether it's the Secretary of State's office, the legislators, what have you. And it's so important to be able to say, look, this doesn't make sense or this does make sense, regardless of what affiliation that we are.
And the one thing I would jump in is, by the way, what we've done in Colorado, it has worked. Colorado, since the passage, we're nearing the 10th anniversary of the law that Tiffany's talking about, same-day voter registration, early voting, vote by mail for all, has led Colorado to have some of the highest turnout in the entire country. But our counter-disinformation has also worked. In 2022, after, 5-6 years about straight lies about vote by mail, straight lies coming from the highest office in the United States, last general election, over 98% of Coloradans, Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliateds, with unprecedented access to vote in person, with days and weeks of early voting, chose to use their mail ballot. It's tough, but we're seeing results.
I want to go to Professor Green, because this has been such an optimistic panel, I think realistic about the challenges of bipartisan work, but also there's a lot of hopeful examples maybe of people using partisan involvement in elections too, as you've written about, as your work has gotten into to build trust. And so I'm going to ask a question that's maybe a little unfair, but what about the counterexamples? What about the issue where this doesn't work, right? And the examples that we're seeing where having partisan involvement isn't being used to build trust. The examples, the challenges that we're seeing where, you try and get bipartisan support for something and you don't get there. What is the effect of that? And how do you work towards consensus when the divides aren't all partisan, right? When within parties there's divides.
Yeah, so first of all, can you hear me?
No.
I'm not mic'd. I'll use this. Okay. Is that better? Yep. Okay, good. Shoot, I was hoping this one would work. Yeah, I mean, that's really sort of the challenge of our time in a lot of ways. And I think what we're seeing is not a breakdown in the adversarial process as it's kind of embedded in our election system, but instead I think we're seeing the unfortunate phenomenon that we have an increase in bad faith actors working within that system. And so by bad faith, I mean people who aren't proceeding from a position of truthfulness and sort of not proceeding from a position of trying to sort of ensure that things are done honestly. And I think, I teach contract law, and one of the presumptions in contract law when you have parties negotiating a contract is that they proceed in good faith. And so, I think that, again, the problem isn't the adversarial structure. The problem is people operating outside of that structure intentionally to undermine the system. So I think that is something that's very hard to address. I definitely don't have ready-made solutions for that problem. I think other people on this panel are much better suited to talk about that. But I do think that sort of identifying the problem is a big part of it. In other words, that it's not the partisan system; it's these actors who are proceeding in bad faith.
Good. Fair enough. And so I guess to Secretary Fontes, you've sort of had this noteworthy partnership with Recorder richer with Rey's boss in the recorder's office and your former political opponent to defend the integrity of elections and to work together on that. And there's been many a long feature written about the political odd couple and that bipartisan effort. And so I'm interested in what you feel it's accomplishing. I'm interested in what you've seen as it's played out as you've worked with Republicans in your state. I know you also worked on some legislation. I don't believe it's moved forward with former Secretary of State Ken Bennett to put ballot images online, which is an effort that I think, I'm not sure the status of that bill, but I don't think it's moved forward at this point. As you work on these bipartisan efforts, where do you see the successes and where do you see it, the people that it's not reaching?
Well, before I get there, I want to reiterate what the professor said here. This is, most of the time we frame this as Party A versus Party B.
Yeah.
And I think that's wrong. This is not Party A versus Party B. This is people of goodwill versus people who are not of goodwill, and it's really that simple. We've seen examples of this throughout American history. People of not goodwill can emerge just about anywhere on the political spectrum. And so right now, they tend to be a little bit more on one side of the political aisle than the other. And so it's very convenient to say this is a partisan problem. It's not a partisan problem. It's a problem of character. It's a problem of honor. And it's a problem of a lack of integrity with some of those folks in the systems who want to get into the system and game the system for their own personal political benefit. And the way you get past that is by setting the good example, and which is, Stephen and I have a great relationship, and it emerged from a very, very cantankerous, very hotly contested election. How did we start getting it back together? I invited him after he beat me in 2020, and it was a pretty contentious election. I mean, there were a lot of very hard personal attacks, and I still remind him how unfortunate all of that was every time I get a chance. But what I did was, because we saw, and this was in 2020, we saw the emerging sort of obstinance about transference of power. And I thought, we've got to set the example, even if it's just at the county recorder's office. And so I invited Stephen to come over, and we did a tour of the warehouse. Rey was there, a whole bunch of folks were there to meet their new boss. And I personally greeted him in the lobby as he came in. We had a photographer and a videographer there. And we shot a video of the two of us having a conversation, showing him the processes on the inside, the warehouse on the inside, which he had never been in, meeting the folks who actually ran the elections, who he had never met, and basically handing the torch over on video for everybody to see. And when staff said, okay, here you go, they showed me the video, and I said, it's not done yet. And what I asked them to do was put a last frame on that video of the seal of the office. My name is 29th Maricopa County Recorder, and then his name is 30th Maricopa County Recorder, to show that transfer of power. Now, is that bipartisan? No, that's just the way that America is supposed to work. And by doing these sorts of things, we can communicate very, very clearly. And the impact is, oh wow, you can transfer power peacefully, even after a very hard-fought campaign. That's the American spirit. That's the way we do things. And history has always, American history particularly, I think the expert is right here, shows us that we've had some really, really hard contests that end in peaceful transfers. Having an image burnt in effigy of your political opponent, which is what happened in one of the boroughs in New York in the 1870s. I mean, literally a lynched doll of the political opponent with the opponent's name burned in the street.
I think we still do that in my home state of New York.
Well, in some places, I don't know, but those are the kinds of contests that end up resulting in a transfer of power. We get to choose whether it's a peaceful transfer and there's respect for that person and the will of the voters or not. And some of us in America are choosing poorly. And that's the problem. We've identified in a lot of ways in legislative areas, in the areas of executive offices across the country, in the judiciary, in some narrow circumstances, we've seen sort of not the greatest of faith, not the best faith. Our system isn't broken. we still depend on that oath. We have to have that civic faith. And that's one of the things that I've really been talking about a lot over the last couple of years. And I think it was one of the things that really brought so many Republicans over and so many non-affiliated voters over to my campaign in the fall was we're restoring faith that we have in one another as citizens, as Americans, because we're still Americans. And I'm not always as comfortable saying that this is a partisan problem, because that reduces us to partisanship automatically. I think it's the question of we've lost faith in one another, and that's what fascism does. It tears down the faith that we have in one another to do our jobs, to execute our duties, to be good neighbors. And it tears down that faith so that we are more easily divided along partisan lines, faith lines, sexual orientation lines, gender lines, color of skin lines, right? As long as we can maintain that faith in one another as Americans, first and foremost, all of the rest of it can be much stronger. And all of those divisions seem less important. And so for me, moving forward, and I think that's the impact that this has had, right? These questions of just standing up for the other and standing with the other, like we did with Michelle Reagan when Arizona joined ERIC. She's a Republican secretary. I'm a Democrat. We joined ERIC because we all thought it was the right thing to do. When I stood with Bill Montgomery, who's now on the Arizona Supreme Court, very, very conservative guy. I mean, he had AR-15s in his office when he was the county attorney. We stood together and did public service announcements about sticking together as Americans first. These efforts along the way have had a positive impact, and I think that's one of the reasons why Arizona, particularly, and so many other states rejected sort of the emergent fascism that so many other candidates presented in the fall of 2022.
So I think I'd like everyone to speak to this, maybe starting with Rey. Maybe is the issue, especially as someone who works at the local level with local constituents, right? With Maricopa residents and voters, is the issue a partisan issue? Is the divide a partisan divide, or should we have actually just named the panel something else?
Yes, we should have named it Team Fontes. And I'm just kidding. No, that was eloquently stated. And I will say that I am here in Recorder Richard's stead. He couldn't make it, so he sent a letter for me to read off about Adrian Fontes. No, I'm just kidding. You were like, no, but I wanted to.
I like it that you're going to make news.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I had to deal with this for 4 years.
Exactly. That's why he wanted to leave. It was not so much. But I think it is, exactly as Secretary of State Fontes indicated. There is an element of bipartisanship that is necessary in statute requiring that for fair and equitable election to have that representation. But we know that outside of, that's a necessary element. You want to have that so people believe in that. But at the outside of that, at the higher level, it's one of those things where if you don't foster respect and civility amongst what I think is a great accomplishment for Secretary Fontes and Recorder Richard to be able, and I call it the dynamic duo. They probably don't appreciate that, but I think they do travel and they do represent that ability to have that civility and that respect. So it's not a bipartisan, it happens to be that there are differing parties, but it shows on that level that it's possible and it's necessary. And also just building those personal relationships are, I think, speak louder than the required mandated bipartisan boards. That's just a necessary element again, but to bridge this gap, I think it has to come with that personal relationships and empowering those individuals that have a voice, whether they are partisan, but I don't think it is 100% partisan, it's just that the public sees it that way, so then we have to show that that is possible.
So then, Secretary Griswold, I think you touched on this too, right? Like, how do you move this out of the partisan realm? How do you move this away from being a discussion that's had on partisan lines and frame it in a way that's a more constructive way to solving the problems or to addressing the misinformation that's out there, as opposed to people hardening in their partisan camps?
Well, I actually do think this is partisan. It's both partisan and not partisan at the same time. This isn't Democrats versus Republicans, your neighbors versus neighbors. Americans are good people. They want fairness. They want to play by a fair set of rules. But at the same time, we cannot discount the fact that this is part of the national Republican strategy to cause chaos to take elections. That is what's happening. It is funded, right? There are strategists who sit around a table and think about how do we win this election. It's not all Republicans. Many Republicans in red states who, 5 years ago we would have said they are conservative Republicans, are being primaried and losing their jobs by extremists. The Wyoming Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, was primaried. Now there's an election denier Secretary of State. In South Dakota, the same thing happened. So that is part of party politics, right? That doesn't mean that Republicans are bad. That's not what that means. There are great Republicans all across this country, and that's what I think we're talking about. But you can't discount that it's a political strategy. All of this is about power, right? This is just about power. How do we win elections, and how do we take elections if we don't win for power? So I think there's several strategies to get through this. And honestly, I am very optimistic, very optimistic. We had election deniers running in this country in every swing state where there was a race to oversee elections. Would have been a disaster if they won. A total disaster. Americans did not let them win, right? That happened in Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, Minnesota, New Mexico. But I do think that there are several things we can do. Number one, states have to strengthen their laws immediately. And if states can hopefully do that in a bipartisan way, like we have in Colorado, they should. But if there isn't that support there, states still have to strengthen their laws. Number two, we have to prosecute. Colorado is another good example of Republicans prosecuting. Mesa County. There's a Republican district attorney who is prosecuting the insider breach we have there. That's great. We have to make sure laws are strengthened and then people realize there's consequences to compromising voting equipment, to threatening people's lives, all this political mayhem. This isn't just disagreement. This is people inciting folks to violence. To breaching election infrastructure. This is one of the biggest issues we've had in American history. Strengthen our laws, prosecute, but ultimately it will come down to American voters, not just Democrats, Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliateds rejecting the overall message of chaos and extremism. And that's what we saw in the 2022 election, where they could. American voters, Republicans, unaffiliateds, and Democrats rejected that extremism. We are not out of the woods. There are now 6 election denier secretaries of state. There are 150 election deniers desecrating the halls of Congress as we speak. There are 6 election denier U.S. senators. Election deniers have took over parties in Colorado, in Michigan, in other states. We are not out of the woods, but I am so optimistic that Americans, again, understand that their neighbors are not their enemies. Understand that this extremism is intended to divide us and will have the opposite effect, will unite us, and will get through this period of American history.
So on that note, I'd like to turn to questions from the audience, who I'm sure have excellent ones. Is there anything anyone would like to ask of this panel?
Hi, I'm Melanie Sloan from American Oversight. How much do you all blame or hold social media responsible for the disinformation and misinformation? So rather than just partisanship, actually, but the problems of all of this ramping up on social media and being spread that way?
Not at all. That's like asking in the 1920s, how much do you hold newspapers accountable, or how much do you hold the Telegraph accountable? Social media is just a means by which bad ideas can be spread more quickly. So I think the right way to ask that question is, how bad is it that people are manipulating social media to destroy our democracy? How bad is the emergent fascism And how vulnerable are we to the much more quick spread through social media? So respectfully, it's not social media's fault. It's the fault of the people that want to destroy our democracy. We can't blame a thing. It's like saying it's your car's fault for getting you there late. No, it's your fault because you didn't fix to make sure your tires were good, or that there was gas in the tank, or some other thing. I think we put too much emphasis on blaming the thing and not enough emphasis on the responsibility that those individuals have. There are fascists active in this country. Jena just listed off who they are. She politely calls them election deniers. I'm supposed to call them election enthusiasts as an official position of my office, but I personally prefer just calling them what they are. They are fascists. And if they don't want to be called fascists, they need to stop acting like fascists. This democracy can be strong and will be strong because I believe, as the Secretary does, in the American people, regardless of party affiliation. They're using every tool that they can against us, and they're losing, and they're going to continue to lose because we're going to continue to make sure that everybody has a voice at the table, everybody that's eligible to vote can vote, and that those votes are counted accurately. And we're always going to see bumps in the road. It's a human endeavor. But I only disagree with the framing of your question, respectfully. It's not social media's fault. It's the fascists' fault, and we have to blame them directly and not give them a pass.
I agree that with Adrian that it's political actors, right? The kidnapping attempt of the governor of Michigan was incited by the lies. The attack on Paul Pelosi was incited because of the lies. The insurrection on the United States Capitol was incited because of the lies. The police officers who lost their life protecting American democracy on January 6th were incited by the words of political actors, of elected officials who have the gall to still show up. At the same time, I do believe social media is much different than printed paper. We know that social media has the ability, that all this data about us. And so instead of sending a message written out to, a lot of different people, there's a way to really know who you are. Oh, you like to wear a green shirt. You like to go on long walks. You like this type of dog. You like all of this stuff about you. And I'm going to create a message just for you that is much more convincing. So I do believe that social media, companies that are as successful as they are because they were created in this country, in a democracy, they do have a level that they have to abide to make sure they aren't inciting violence and destroying democracy in this country. So I agree with the Secretary that it's actors who are inciting, but I also think social media has not lived up to the very basic duty of making sure that they are not used to destroy a country.
Tiffany, I'd love to hear your perspective on this,
Yeah,
too,
no,
as someone who sees it locally.
Sure, and I absolutely agree with what's been said. I also do want to add, though, social media is a significant challenge for us county clerks. And let me give you an example. In 2000, we all know that election, right? I worked that election. I happened to be in Oregon. Social media wasn't really there at all. And so we were able to get in front of it quicker. We were able to work with our local news stations, our reporters, our radio, and get in front of it much better than we can now. Now it is instantaneous. Within seconds, misinformation can go out. And it might be an election judge that isn't an election denier, right? And they come into our office, start working our elections, and all of a sudden they think they see something, and instead of coming to a county clerk or a supervisor, they immediately push something out on social media. For us that are boots on the ground, we're short-staffed, limited resources, a lot of us don't have public information officers, that type of thing. To get in front of maybe a bad tweet or something wrong on Facebook, it's virtually impossible for us to stay on top of it. So I do think it's an issue. I think it's a problem that people actually believe everything they see, and just like the Secretary said, it gets into your brain, and they can just, it's really, really challenging. So I would say that it is a big issue for us at the local level. especially in counties my size. And I'm not sure how we're going to get in front of that, except that people have just got to stop believing it and go to your trusted source. We did a big campaign about your trusted source, which is go to your local county clerk and get the facts. Ask those questions. A lot of us in Colorado, we do a lot of outreach with our political parties, with our Rotaries, Kiwanis, League of Women Voters, wherever we can get. We do tours. We do everything we possibly can at the local level. And they'll still say to us, we trust you. You've done this a long time, Tiffany. We trust you. It's the other guys. It's the other states. It's, that type of thing. Because I saw on Twitter that so-and-so was doing this or whatever. So I think you have a very valid point from my perspective. And as an elected official, we just have to continue to try to educate and fight these folks that are really making our lives challenging.
Rebecca, how does this play into how has social media changed the partisan role in elections? How has it amplified or sort of shaped it?
Yeah, so I think it's a problem that we haven't caught up to. So our system relies on various points of transparency, and we assume that by making something public in certain ways that that will have the intended effect of enhancing public trust in election processes. And I think we're finding, as Tiffany was describing, that what we might assume where let's for example make a live stream available, you would assume that would make people feel like they were seeing the law being followed. And of course we know that is not necessary. It's a double-edged sword. In other words, some people might feel like that transparency is helpful, and other times it's actually creating a problem of fueling conspiracy theories and so forth. So I think the problem is that we haven't figured out how to calibrate transparency mechanisms in this modern information environment, and I think states are experimenting with lots of different ways to do that, but we definitely haven't figured it out. And I think that, as Tiffany points out, it's sort of the speed of information flows that makes it so hard to harness and to sort of figure out how do you make an election transparent while at the same time not exposing it to 1,000 conspiracy theories blooming.
And obviously in no jurisdiction have conspiracy theories flowered more sort of heartily than in Maricopa, right? And so I had earlier referenced a bill that Secretary Fontes had spoken about putting ballot images online. That had some bipartisan support, but one of the concerns about that bill was that putting ballot images online could allow them to be used, to sort of weaponized to support things that were not true, to support conspiracy theories. And so I was hoping Rey could speak to not necessarily that particular piece of legislation, but that issue of things being kind of contorted and presented in ways that are not accurate, of kind of efforts to be transparent backfiring in that way, and how you plan for it and how you deal with it, because at this point it's part of the landscape.
Well, I think as a professor indicated, sometimes we have to learn how to better utilize some of our, what we call transparency. We have live streaming, it's running 24/7 under the tutelage of Recorder Fontes. It says, we used to be under law, and it is still in law, you only do that during counting. Well, then it starts saying, well, you're shutting it off, and that's when you're doing something nefarious. So we're now running it 24/7, maintain that. But it lends itself to say, somebody's in there backing up a server, and it's, oh my gosh, they're adding votes 6 months after the election. And it's like, well, the canvas is, so there is some things of trying to delicately balance, even on the social media, the speed at which it travels, but the balance to that is, yes, it's different than a telegram. It's different than the Pony Express, but the fact is then we just need to learn how to counteract as fast as that speed. So I know we've created a Just the Facts page based on some of the Cyber Ninja audits, some of this stuff where we quickly were able to respond as fast as they're able to, whether it's fastest or it's fact or whatever it may be, we can provide that. But from a local standpoint, obviously I think we need to learn and keep developing these tools, keep sharing these tools as local election officials. I use the term R&D, and the recorder's tired of hearing me say that because it's not research and development. It's rob and duplicate in elections. If you're able to say who's doing it well, who's representing well, then you go and say, let me borrow that. And I think we'll build on these tools and we'll be able to act at lightning speed in counteracting those that are responding in lightning speed. So
I think one of the important points here is insofar as the data and getting information out there is concerned, what we've seen is it almost doesn't matter what you put out there or at what speed you put it out there. The bad actors, the political actors, are going to take it, bend it, and lie about it, or they're just going to make stuff up, right? Like they did about Speaker Toma, the governor, myself, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Apparently we're all laundering Sinaloa and cartel money through HELOC loans in Arizona.
That seems impractical.
Well, it's not just impractical, it's, pardon my French, it's total bullshit. And it almost doesn't matter, because the group of folks that we're engaged with right now don't care. And so I think that we have to do the adjusting that we have to do, and we have to deal with these actors, but it almost doesn't matter where it comes from, because we're even to the point where they're introducing this stuff, not just in Congress, not just in other places, but in state houses, in official proceedings. You know, one of our representatives lost her seat because of these lies that are literally being put into official testimony. And I don't know that she would have lost her seat if it had just been against myself and the governor. But the fact that the Speaker of the House was included in that wild, fanciful conspiracy. So transparency is transparency for the folks that are going to rely on those trusted sources and the folks that are going to be of goodwill. But there's that faction of folks that just, it isn't going to make a hill of beans of difference no matter what.
And on that point that when you're talking about the Senate bill that talks about putting out there, and I know other states are consider or actually doing it, where we're going to post and I know that Secretary supports that because it's transparent. But there is some of that thing of, will it be weaponized? And factually, Maricopa County has 2.4 million voters, second largest voting jurisdiction. Putting 1.9 million ballots on an internet or on a thing and allowing John Doe to go, well, I'll see you in a year if you're really going to review that, kind of thing. So, but at least it's a step towards saying, let's provide this, then it provides access for those folks that are in the MIT world that says, I can do something with that. So I think it's a good step, and it's just us, again, learning how to utilize that tool, but it's a forward-facing possibility that will, again, I think help towards that.
We've had someone waiting to ask a question very patiently. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't really have a question per se, but maybe just a comment, but kind of build on the optimism and opportunity, and I think to a certain degree bipartisanship. In 2022, I was the voter protection director for Maryland, and when I came into the job, we had about 300 names in the database for workers, volunteers. And when I left just a few months later, there was 1,500. And while I'm sure I did a good job in recruiting, I think that we had an exciting candidate for governor and the opportunity to flip that seat, and we did. I really think the motivation was fear within the electorate. They are responding to the stories of the threats to democracy, and we have a fertile database, or we have an opportunity to recruit new people into the system right now based on the energy that they're bringing to this, and we need to capitalize on it. We need to have outreach and the education we talked about yesterday. Just my.
Any thoughts on? Oh. We do have another. Yes, please.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Tommy
for that.
Gong. Tommy Gong, election official from California. And it's great to have this diverse panel that we have here, both from academia, state level, and local level. So my question today is, election officials, we're only as strong as our weakest link. And obviously we've seen some weak links. And so what I want to ask is, what can we do as a profession to ensure the highest ethical skills, standards, and professional conduct?
Guys?
Well, the idea of professionalizing the election administration has been kicked around quite a bit. I have a CEIR certification from the Election Center. Humphrey School also has a certification up in, I think it's Wisconsin? Minnesota. Sorry, I'm from Arizona, I get them mixed up. Sorry, Steve
think you just
Secretary.
offended some people in the crowd here, Secretary Fontes.
All right, I'll get a drink for that, Steve. Sorry. And there are other efforts to have some sort of a professional certification made. I mean, this is an organic thing that's happening across the country in a whole bunch of different areas. States and secretaries' offices are more formalizing training. We're moving to a much more asymmetric training model in Arizona, where at one point it was 40 hours of butts in seats listening to lectures. We are now going to be splitting that up so that there's all kinds of nodes and abilities for folks to use technology to continue that training. I don't know that there is a national standard. I don't know that there needs to be a national standard, particularly because of the diversity of jurisdictions and the different ways that we run elections in America. But I would say that we need to figure out at what level a certification, perhaps, a formal education of some sort of formal training is necessary, and then we need to get that funded. And that, at the end of the day, is the ultimate thing. You know, it's one of those things that I harp on all the time. States, localities, we've got to put a president on our ballots. We've got to put senators on our ballots. We've got to put congressmen on our ballots. We've got to follow all of the federal rules. How much money does the federal government give La Plata County or Maricopa County? Nothing. It's an unfunded mandate to follow all of these rules with no sustained federal funding. So if there's anything that we can start with, it's to make sure that if you want us to do all of this stuff, fund it, Congress. Fund it, and you'll get better elections.
I'm not just trying to pick a fight every single question with Adrian, a little bit, but no, I actually agree with what in Colorado is training, and Tiffany can talk about how much we invest in my office and the counties on making sure people are trained. Training is not going to stop this problem. There are Ivy League educated lawyers who are election denier U.S. senators, right? Election workers should be trained. They should know how to do their job in a high standard, and if they need support, the secretary should be there to support counties. Elections are very hard. But the attack on democracy is about, again, power. It is about power. You can fall victim to conspiracies if you listen to them too much. But I'm going to venture to say that a lot of these people spreading these lies do not believe that Chavez raised from the grave to steal voting equipment to ship to Spain, and then it went to Germany and they stole servers. Like, they don't believe this stuff. It's about trying to steal power when you lose elections. So we should absolutely be investing in training. We should be investing in election workers. We should be prosecuting when election workers, 1/3 across this country, say they're afraid to do their job. 1/6 have been threatened. Prosecutors should be taking it seriously. But ultimately, we need to hold these bad political actors accountable. And we do that through prosecution, strengthening the law, but the American people, again, will have to do it over and over and over at the ballot box until this brand of political strategy proves to the people highly investing and funding it that it is not working.
Other thoughts?
I think one of the most heartening things that we heard yesterday was about this idea that there's been this problem of getting younger people involved in elections and election administration, and the idea that they've been galvanized by the last several years. And I can tell you from my perspective, I think people are coming to law school because they believe that they want to help our democracy function better, particularly at William and Mary, but at a lot of other schools that are starting election programs to harness the power of legal education towards improving the system. So I do think that there is a shifting tide in terms of the understanding of young people that they can get involved and make a difference and help right the ship.
I thought that was a very gentle pushback on the whole Ivy-educated lawyers thing.
I just thought I'd try.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Are there other questions from the audience? I think David's up here telling us we're going to get the hook. But
well, let's all give a hand to this great panel. I just was really, one thing that I was reminded of, and I hadn't really stuck with me, but I knew from before, that I was so glad we were all reminded of, the story of Secretary Griswold partnering with her former opponent, Secretary Williams, in Colorado for election security. The story of Secretary Fontes, 2 years before he was Secretary Fontes, inviting his opponent who had defeated him in the recorder's office, and for that peaceful transfer of power. I think many of us know the story of Tina Barton, a city clerk in Michigan, who had just lost her race for county clerk in Michigan in 2020. And when lies were spread about the Michigan election, she stood up on her own and defended the integrity of an election that she had lost. These incidents shouldn't surprise us. They should be the norm. But they're becoming surprising, which is disturbing. And I just want to thank all of the panelists, especially for their example. And with that.